Hi, we're the Anserines. Before we begin, I'd like to list some content warnings for this talk. We're not really talking about any of these things in any real depth, but we are touching on them, so we thought it was best to just mention it up front. The content warnings are psychiatry, fascism, war, food and digestion, death, and perceptions of other realities. So, here's your fair warning that things are about to get weird and philosophical. Before we can begin this talk, we have to work out what a talk is. Is a talk just a sequence of words? If we gave this talk to a crowd of people who didn't understand English, they wouldn't get anything from it. To them, it would just be a sequence of sounds and images. Sounds and images are not a talk. So, a talk, whatever it is, can't exist in a vacuum. A talk exists in a context in which you have some idea of what to expect from a talk, as well as how to interpret the words and grammatical structures of whatever language the talk is given in. Your personal context will influence how you understand these words. Depending on what experiences have led you to this moment, you may be thinking that this is mind-blowing stuff or abject drivel. In a very real sense, this talk does not exist except within your own minds. Texts are not finished objects. The history of humanity is the history of language, because the human is the animal that can tell its own story. This talk is a story. It has tropes, characters, structure, allusions, themes, imageries, all the constituent parts of a whole that is only completed in the act of observation. For every sign present in the talk itself, there are infinitely more things external to the talk being pointed to. Even these words only make sense because you've heard them before, in other contexts, and in uttering them, I am reminding you of those past encounters. Every utterance is a part of the eternal human conversation. All stories are parts of the same grand narrative. How is it meaningful to draw a line and say, here is where the talk began, just because I started speaking then? If I do say that, then it's really not so much a literal statement as it is a social one. Society, of course, likes to draw lines. It likes to separate one thing from another, to catalogue and dissect things, as though a thing is a meaningful concept absent from its interactions with other things. Over himself, over his own body and mind, the individual is sovereign. That's what individualism is, the idea that one can draw a line between two bodies. It's a molecular viewpoint, taking as its main object of analysis the single human. Medicine is the same. Psychoanalysis too. Schizoanalysis differs. In schizoanalysis, we see the molar masses as well. Everything exists in a place. Franny is listening to a program on wolves. I say to her, "Would you like to be a wolf?" She answers haughtily, "How stupid! You can't be one wolf. You're always 8 or 9, 6 or 7. You can't be one wolf. And this can't be one talk. It's part of a conference, part of a culture, part of a conversation. Always apart. Always partitioned. Always particles." But let's start this part. Gilles Deleuze was a 20th century French philosopher who wrote on a wide range of topics, including metaphysics, semiotics, psychoanalysis, and Marxism. A key idea underpinning a lot of his work is the idea of multiplicity, a kind of fusion of the apparently opposed ideas of one and multiple. This kind of fusion of opposites happens a lot in his work. We have the one multiple, the molar molecular, the real virtual. Deleuze's perspective is essentially that by limiting ourselves to only one side of a dichotomy like that, we fail to see the bulk of a story. It's not just about looking at each perspective, but allowing those perspectives to coexist and interact. His collaborator, Félix Guattari, was a psychoanalyst. For most of his life, he worked at an experimental clinic called La Borde, a center for a Marxist psychiatric practice known as institutional analysis. La Borde isn't like most psych hospitals. It's more like a commune. The patients share responsibilities with the staff and even participate in meetings. There are no uniforms, and it's not about curing people so much as helping people develop initiative and express themselves politically and artistically. The experience of working at Laborde taught Guattari that psychosis wasn't just a deficit, but a way of experiencing the world that came with its own merits, an idea he took into his later philosophical works. To Guattari, a patient's symptoms were a product of their environment and experiences. You can't fix a patient's distress completely without also transforming society. Deleuze and Guattari's major collaboration, Capitalism and Schizophrenia, has a very idiosyncratic style. It's kind of written in a style reminiscent of the psychotic symptom of thought disorder, especially the flight of ideas, illogicality, and tangential speech. At times it's borderline impenetrable, shifting from serious observation to outright joke in such a way that you're never entirely sure whether to take it seriously or to throw the book across the room. They draw connections between apparently unconnected topics, giving you a multitude of perspectives on everything, sometimes apparently contradictory. Often it's more like poetry than philosophy. The central ideas of Capitalism and Schizophrenia are about the relationship between capitalism, society, fascism, family, and madness. To Deleuze and Guattari, schizophrenia is a tendency of capitalism. Our society produces schizos the same way it produces Prel shampoo and Ford cars, the only difference being that the schizos are not saleable. Schizophrenia is something that capitalism produces, but then has to control and subjugate, because if it were allowed to roam free, it would destroy capitalism itself. Society is then basically a process of imposing systems of control upon the human mind, of causing people to not only participate in their own repression, but to desire it. These systems of control are how Deleuze and Guattari view Freud's Oedipus complex, not as something inherent to humans, but as society's way of subverting and redirecting erotic desire into a tool of control. Fascism, then, is an extreme expression of this desire for self-repression. All these ideas, perspectives, and tendencies together form schizoanalysis, the name Deleuze and Guattari give to their philosophical practice. The precise meaning of schizoanalysis isn't fixed, even in Deleuze and Guattari's own work. It's something that is continually changing to meet the needs of the various situations it's applied in. But the broad idea is this: to analyze society in such a way that refuses simple reductionist answers, that complexifies everything and draws together all sorts of contrasting and conflicting ideas into itself. This talk is a schizoanalysis. Often we think about knowledge like it's a tech tree in a video game. A field of study has some fundamental concepts that everyone who studies it needs to understand, and then each subfield builds on those concepts progressively, sometimes by adding its own ideas, and sometimes by refining or correcting the fundamental concepts. This arborescent way of thinking is all about hierarchy, what concepts depend on other concepts, and separation, what are the fundamental differences between two ideas. In A Thousand Plateaus, Deleuze and Guattari propose an alternative model, what they call a rhizome. The rhizome is a nonlinear, non-hierarchical way of organizing ideas, essentially working bottom-up rather than top-down. In a rhizome, connections can be made between any two concepts, like a wandering train of thought moving from topic to topic. The rhizome isn't so much a story as it is a network with no clear beginning or end. Basically, it's a way of looking at things that respects, or even centers, the ways in which they're multiple. Deleuze and Guattari give 6 principles that characterize the rhizome. 1 and 2, connection and heterogeneity. Any point of a rhizome can be connected to any other, and must be. A rhizome is all about connections between arbitrary points. There are no rules about what can be connected, anything can be connected to anything else, and any two things will be connected in some way. 3. Multiplicity. It is only when the multiple is effectively treated as a substantive multiplicity that it ceases to have any relation to the one. The rhizome is multiple, so much so that it can't be unified. There are no limits to how much it can encompass, and once you've got the whole thing in your head, you'll probably struggle to even give it one single name. It's not one field of study, it's all of them. 4. A-signifying rupture. A rhizome may be broken, shattered at any given spot, but it will start up again on one of its old lines, or on new lines. like I said, no limits. If you try to contain the rhizome, it will find a way to get out of its cage. An obvious link might not work, but then you can always find an oblique one. 5 and 6. Cartography and decalcomania. It's a map and not a tracing. What distinguishes the map from the tracing is that it is entirely oriented towards an experimentation in contact with the real. A rhizome is all about connections, but it's not just the connections. Those connections exist in a real landscape, just like the roads on a map. A map doesn't just tell you where the roads are, it also marks physical features like hills and valleys, as well as social features like towns and countries.
Deleuze and Guattari didn't invent the word rhizome. It comes from Greek, meaning a mass of roots. It's no coincidence they talk about experimentation in contact with the real, when that's exactly what the roots of a plant do. They grow in different directions, trying to find nutrients and water so as to serve the plant that they're attached to. And between these roots are mycelia, a network of hyphae belonging to fungi that connect up all the roots of various plants into one massive mycorrhizal network. This network gets really big. The largest known fungus, possibly the largest living thing, is a single specimen of Armillaria osteae that spans over 9 square kilometers and weighs over 30,000 metric tons. The honey mushrooms it produces, which are edible, once properly cooked, by the way, look like individual organisms in the forest, but they're actually just parts of one massive organism. And that's just one fungus. The complete network will consist of many fungi and many plants, all networked together. The networks extend for miles in all directions, and the total length of all the mycelial connections in the soil is about half the length of the Milky Way galaxy. So, this network exists, we know that. But what does it do? Well, the mycorrhizal network allows plants and fungi to share water and nutrients, and they can even communicate with the other plants and fungi around them. This allows for a kind of trade of nutrients between different plants and fungi in the same network. For example, a tree that's getting a lot of phosphates can pump the nutrients it doesn't need into the network for other plants in less phosphorus-rich areas to take. Plants that aren't getting enough light to photosynthesize enough can get sugars from the network from plants that have excess. There is even a class of plants called mycoheterotrophs that feed themselves exclusively from the network, and they don't even have the chlorophyll they need to photosynthesize, so they're not even green. As for the messages, well, we don't yet fully understand them. Some of it is chemical. Plants release chemicals to signal to other plants, often producing a warning of some pest or pathogen that might be dangerous to them. But there's also electrical signals produced by the fungi themselves, complex patterns of voltages passed along the network that some scientists have even likened to human language with words and sentences. Though we don't really know what, if anything, the language might mean. Plants talk. Fungi talk. They're all interconnected and interdependent. A forest is a plural system.
And just like trees, mental phenomena don't have one root, but a whole network of roots. In the plural community, we have this idea of traumagenic and endogenic and all sorts of other genics of plurality, describing what caused you to be plural. But these things never really have one cause. Your psychological makeup is the product of a whole host of factors, not just the presence or absence of trauma. And trauma itself is not one thing, but a whole lot of different things that could happen to a person. Post-traumatic stress disorder is the name we give to the after effects of trauma on a person's mind. It's had many different names over the years. In World War I, it was known as shell shock. Later, it was battle fatigue. Most of these names specifically linked it to combat in war. Nowadays, we recognize PTSD as a more general trauma thing. You don't have to be a soldier to get it. Any traumatic event could cause it. But what's traumatic for one person isn't going to be traumatic for everyone. There are all sorts of other factors that could influence whether something will be traumatic enough to cause PTSD, such as neurodiversity, absence of a support system, prior experiences, and personal history. These can all influence your mental makeup in such a way as to make it more likely to develop PTSD. So, why don't we think of these as causes on the same level as trauma? In history, there are often many perspectives of looking at the same event. The First World War began when Bosnian Serb Gavrilo Princip shot Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary, which the Austro-Hungarians responded to by putting pressure on and ultimately declaring war on Serbia. But that's not the only thing that caused the war. Without the imperialism of European powers and the complex network of alliances between them, the war between Austria-Hungary and Serbia might never have exploded into a world-spanning conflict. Without the annexation of smaller countries like Bosnia into the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and without the nationalist fervour all across Europe, Princip might not have made his assassination attempt in the first place. If the driver of Archduke Ferdinand's car hadn't accidentally reversed into Princip, that point-blank shot could have been a distance shot that missed. All these molecular and molar factors influenced each other, as well as the outcome of these events. To attribute the war entirely to Princip and to his co-conspirators is to follow great man theory, failing to see the wood for the trees. Labeling an origin of any phenomenon as just one thing is always going to be more about mythology than honesty. It's less about what actually caused you to be plural and more about what perspective you have on your plurality and its origins. I'm not about to take words away from anyone, I just think that these particular terms are often more deceptive than they are descriptive. We are no more a product of trauma than Wilfred Owen's poetry is a product of Gavrilo Princip's actions. When I get anxious, I might say that I've got butterflies in my stomach. This is a bodily sensation that comes from your mental state, realized as digestive discomfort. Psychological stress can also trigger things like irritable bowel syndrome. These are examples of what is sometimes called the gut-brain axis. Ophiocordyceps unilateralis is a parasitic fungus that infects ants and essentially takes control of them, making them walk to places better suited for fungal growth. Toxoplasma gondii is a parasite that reproduces in cats, but is also capable of infecting other warm-blooded animals. Infection with Toxoplasma gondii alters rodent behavior, making them more vulnerable to feline predators, and there's some evidence that it may have related effects on humans. This could be where the crazy cat lady idea comes from. Microbes in the human digestive tract serve a number of purposes, including disease protection, assisting in digestion, and, yes, even influencing behavior. Gut issues influence the endocrine system, which in turn changes how you feel. There's even a case study suggesting fecal microbiota transplants as a treatment for bipolar disorder. These aren't accidents. These microbes evolved to live in your gut, and it makes sense that evolutionary adaptations that cause a microbe to impact your life and behavior could well be beneficial for the microbe itself. You aren't just your brain, you're your belly too. If we took your brain out of your body and stuck it into another body, your behavior would change, in part due to the different hormones and neurotransmitters made available in your new microbiome. The tiny creatures in your body all have their own agendas, desires, and needs, and they're there to help or hinder you, whichever suits them better. Your gut is a plural system. The human is the planning animal. We build models in our heads of the world around us. Everyone we meet also exists in our heads. We model people in varying levels of detail, and we project our own fears and assumptions onto them in an attempt to predict their behavior. We want to predict their reactions to us so we know how safe it is to be honest with them. Identity is a social game of conforming and distinguishing. Every subculture or subgroup has its own set of norms and assumptions about the world. A name, whether it's an identity label or a personal identifier, is a move in that social game, an act of building a language of the self. I'm queer, by which I mean I fit into what I think your idea of a queer person is. Naming is not just an act of description. Naming is also a tool for validation. Naming says, this is allowed because it has a name. No wonder people go to such lengths to argue over where the boundaries of these labels lie. A name carves out a territory of conforming expression, sometimes in opposition to the norms of the society it exists in. Queers do this, they don't do that. It's the same thing when you pick a name for yourself. You define who you are, use that idea of yourself to decide which actions taken by the system as a whole are you, and which aren't. Sometimes in doing so you reject a part of yourself, either repressing it or splitting it off into another persona. Language is just a tool for modeling others and judging ourselves. An individual in a plural system starts out as just a collection of feelings and desires that gradually coalesce into something that demands for itself a name. Just like how a collection of feelings and desires around gender and sexual desire coalesced into what we now think of as the queer movement. Every human brain is a culture in miniature, and the members of your system are subcultures with their own behaviors and beliefs. I'm not saying words don't matter, words do matter, and names matter, but more as a tool for rewiring our own assumptions than as tools of social change. There is no way of labeling plurality, DID, MPD, whatever, that's going to fix the marginalization we face as mad people. But that which we call a rose by any other name could stink to high heaven. We have to find a name we can live with ourselves that doesn't encourage a broken perspective on our reality. Nothing about us without us. Piss on pity. Slogans of the disability justice movement. The first originates in European political traditions. The 1505 Polish constitution uses a similar phrase to state that the king would not be able to impose laws without the consent of the nobility, though in its modern context it's more about pushing back at governments and other organizations who impose policy on disabled people and other marginalized people without consulting and involving those people properly in the process. The second comes from anti-charity activism of the 1990s, when disabled activists were protesting a particular charity telethon event that raised money by portraying disabled people as tragic, broken, or otherwise in need of saving. The activist Barbara Lisicki explains, if you make a disabled person an object of charity, you're not going to see them as your equal. As mad people, we fit squarely within the social model of disability. We might not agree that there's anything wrong with us, we might question the medicalized frameworks of precisely what is wrong with us, or we might accept it uncritically, but in any case, we are different than society expects us to be, and we suffer as a result. There are laws and institutions put in place specifically to keep us in check, things that we might well not have agreed to if we'd had the opportunity to decide. And people pity us. Hell, we often pity ourselves, but pity is fragile and easily turns to resentment, especially when more permanent things are stacked against us. Sous l'épave la plage, la beauté est dans la rue. Slogans of the May 1968 Paris Revolt. The first, beneath the cobblestones the beach, refers to the idea that the modern city is built upon a much freer place. The second, beauty is in the street, comes from a poster. It simultaneously argues that art and culture must come from people on the street rather than bourgeois institutions, as well as emphasizing the importance and struggle of including women in the movement. What do we mean when we talk about institutions? An institution can be a rule or social convention, a norm, or an organization. It can also mean a place where mad people are confined. It's the cobblestones that keeps people from seeing the unordered sand in our heads, the beauty in our streets. Institutions are built to last. Sandcastles are washed away easily. As mad people, long-term consistency is something we can struggle with, but that doesn't mean we are any less beautiful. When we were around 10, we thought we were psychic. When we left junior school that year, we left behind a lot of friends. We'd had a bunch of female friends who were all going off to a local all-girls school, and we, as a male-assigned body, weren't going to be joining them. But that summer, in the car driving to visit a famous cave in the south of England, we got a message from one of them in our brain. Sort of. I mean, we couldn't make out any actual words, and in retrospect, it probably wasn't actually her, but a version of her that we'd constructed in our mind, something we'd done to cope with the loss, maybe. That might be one of our first explicitly plural experiences. Sane people have it rough. When they lose a friend, whether they've died, fallen out, or just gone away, they don't get to see or hear from them again. Us crazy people get to hold on to those relationships, see them develop and grow, even in the absence of the actual person. It's not always good, of course. Sometimes it means you end up holding on to someone who was unkind to you, unpleasant memories of someone cruel lingering in the back of your head. But it's not all bad. And when it's good, it's beautiful. We are who we are not despite our madness, but because of it. And as difficult as it can be sometimes,
I don't think we'd ever want to trade that away. The European classical music canon is a history of harmony. We start with the monophonic Gregorian chants, add octaves and fifths to create harmonies. Soon, these give way to the sweeter sounding thirds and sixths that allow for more freedom in the different voices. In the Baroque period, from 1600 to around 1750, we reach a peak, where independence of the different voices is prized above all else, and rules are developed to guide the composer in creating truly contrapuntal works, pieces where two or more independent but interdependent melodic lines play at once. Counterpoint happens when we have multiple melodies that are beautiful both in isolation and when heard together. To achieve this, we have to be in harmony, which limits the possible notes that can play at the same time, but we must also prefer to move melodies in opposition to one another. If one goes up, another comes down, to prevent them all from blending into one. Imitative counterpoint is a particular family of styles where the different voices copy each other while still being in proper counterpoint to one another. For example, the song Row, Row, Row Your Boat is often sung as a round, where the same melody is sung by multiple voices starting at different times. The most complex form of counterpoint, at least among those practiced in the Baroque period, is the fugue. A fugue consists of one main theme, called the subject, that is repeated across the course of the fugue in different keys, while other voices harmonize with it. We start with an exposition where the theme is played on each voice in turn, with the other voices only starting to harmonize after they've played the subject. We then have a series of episodes, where the music developed itself by playing with the subject in a more free style. These episodes are separated by further subject entries, where the subject repeats itself in its entirety in one or more voices. Finally, we have a recapitulation or coda, which is a final subject entry that leads into the end of the piece with a full, satisfying resolution. A collection of lone voices bound together with a common structure, creating something beautiful. What is a rhizome? What is a person? What is a system? What is a wolf? What is a plant? What is a body? A miserable little pile of secrets? Or something more than the sum of its parts? 1 and 2. Connection and heterogeneity. Any point of a rhizome can be connected to any other, and must be. Any two members of a system will necessarily have some relationship, though the exact nature of the relationship will be colored by their individual differences. Even if we're not aware of each other, we're still connected somehow. Without that connection, we're not a single system, but a group of separable parts. 3. Multiplicity. It is only when the multiple is effectively treated as a substantive multiplicity that it ceases to have any relation to the one. Being multiple or plural isn't in opposition to oneness. It's not even in the same game as oneness. It's a totally different way of understanding oneself. I can't count how many of me there are because the individual me's are no more one than the collective is. It's turtles all the way down. 4. Asignifying rupture. A rhizome may be broken, shattered at any given spot, but will start up again on one of its old lines or on new lines. The human mind has an incredible capacity for adaptation. It splits so as to work around problems it encounters, just as a root system will work around rocks in its path. But no split is total, and everything can and must be connected in the complete system. 5 and 6. Cartography and decalcomania. It is a map and not a tracing. What distinguishes the map from the tracing is that it is entirely oriented towards an experimentation in contact with the real. If we draw a map of ourselves, we don't just include the members of our system. We have to keep going, drawing out the structures and landscapes those members exist within. And ultimately, no map of the self can cover the complete territory. So, let's not simplify ourselves.